It must be nice, my mother-in-law said, swirling her wine glass at my own dining table, not having to work. I don't know how you fill your days. I was holding my 6-month-old daughter on my hip with one arm while stirring a pot of pasta sauce with the other, running on maybe 4 hours of broken sleep, and I had, only 2 hours earlier, submitted a client project that would land in my business account as an $11,000 payment by the end of the week. I smiled instead of correcting her, not because I was ashamed of my income, but because I'd learned, over 18 months of marriage into this family, that correcting Diane rarely changed anything except the temperature of the room. I keep busy, I said simply, and let her believe whatever story made her most comfortable. She didn't know that staying home with the baby was, for me, also a full-time freelance graphic design business I'd built from nothing over 3 years. One that had, the previous year, brought in more money than her own son's salary at the accounting firm he complained about constantly. She didn't know, because I'd never told her. And I was about to learn exactly why staying quiet about that had been a mistake. Because 2 weeks later, at a family dinner in front of everyone, Diane brought up my lack of a career, one time too many, and this time, my husband was the one who finally corrected her. I want to tell you exactly how we got to that dinner table, and everything that happened afterward, because this isn't really a story about one dismissive comment. It's a story about 18 months of quietly deciding my silence was easier than my own dignity, and what finally changed my mind. My name is Jenna. I'm 29 years old, and for the past 3 years, I've run a freelance graphic design business specializing in branding for small e-commerce companies, logos, packaging design, social media templates, the kind of visual identity work that small businesses desperately need but can rarely afford a full agency for. I built that business slowly, the unglamorous way most real businesses actually get built. I studied graphic design in college, genuinely loved it, and then spent my early 20s doing exactly what most design graduates do, taking a marketing coordinator job that used maybe 20% of my actual skills, because it paid consistently and came with benefits I couldn't risk losing as a 23-year-old, with student loans and a studio apartment I could barely afford on my own. I started freelancing on the side almost by accident. A former college classmate needed a logo for a small candle business she was starting, offered to pay me $200 for it, and that first small project led to a referral, which led to another, which led, over roughly 18 months, to a genuine side business operating almost entirely through word of mouth and a slowly growing portfolio. By the time I'd been freelancing for about 2 years, my side income had grown to a point where it was regularly matching, and some months exceeding, my full-time marketing salary. I remember the exact moment I did the math seriously for the first time, sitting at my kitchen table with a spreadsheet, comparing 12 months of freelance income against my day job salary, and realizing the numbers weren't close anymore. I gave notice at my marketing job 4 months later, after building enough of a client pipeline to feel confident the transition wouldn't leave me financially exposed. I want to be honest that this wasn't a reckless leap. It was a calculated, carefully planned business decision, the kind any rational person makes when the data clearly supports it. I want to spend some time here describing what those 2 years of full-time freelancing actually looked like, because I think it matters for understanding exactly what Diane was dismissing when she called it dabbling. I built systematic processes for client onboarding, contract management, and project timelines that most small freelancers never bother developing, largely because my background in corporate marketing had taught me the value of professional infrastructure, even in a one-person operation. I invested in proper accounting software, hired a bookkeeper part-time to manage quarterly taxes, and treated the business from day one with the same seriousness I would have brought to managing a team at any traditional company. I built a client base that grew almost entirely through referrals, and a strong portfolio website, working with small e-commerce founders who needed cohesive branding to compete against much larger companies with far bigger marketing budgets. My work included full brand identity packages, logos, color palettes, packaging design, social media template systems, projects that typically ranged from $3,000 to $15,000 depending on scope, with several ongoing retainer clients who paid consistent monthly fees for continued design support. By my second full year of freelancing, before Maddie was even born, my annual revenue had crossed six figures for the first time, a milestone that felt, at the time, like genuine validation of a decision plenty of people in my life had quietly questioned when I first left my stable marketing job. I met Tyler about 6 months before I made that leap to full-time freelancing. He was, from the very beginning, one of the few people who took my business seriously without qualification, asking genuine questions about client acquisition, celebrating milestones with me, never once treating my freelance work as a placeholder for real employment. It's part of why I fell in love with him so completely, honestly. He saw the business I was building clearly, at a time when plenty of other people, including, eventually, his own mother, seemed determined not to. I met Diane for the first time about 4 months into dating Tyler, at a family dinner that I remember being nervous about for entirely ordinary reasons. Meeting a partner's parents for the first time, wanting to make a good impression, the usual anxieties. Diane, Tyler's mother, worked as a corporate attorney for nearly 3 decades before retiring about 5 years before I met her. She'd made partner at a mid-sized firm relatively early in her career, during an era when women in corporate law faced genuinely significant institutional barriers. And I want to be fair to her from the outset of this story. The professional battles she fought were real, and they shaped a worldview that, while it eventually caused real friction between us, came from a place of genuine hard-won conviction rather than simple snobbery. That first dinner went reasonably well, on the surface. Diane asked polite questions about my background, my education, my career. When I mentioned I did freelance graphic design work alongside my marketing job, I noticed something subtle in her reaction, a slight recalibration, a shift from genuine interest to something closer to polite tolerance, the way you might respond to hearing about someone's hobby rather than their actual professional trajectory. I didn't think much of it at the time. First meetings are inherently a little stilted, and I told myself I was reading too much into a brief, ordinary exchange. Over the following months, as Tyler and I grew more serious, and I spent more time around his family, that initial subtle recalibration solidified into a consistent pattern. Diane would ask about my marketing job with genuine engagement, questions about my responsibilities, my trajectory, opportunities for advancement. When the conversation turned to my freelance work, her questions grew noticeably shorter, her follow-up interest noticeably thinner. When I finally made the decision to leave my marketing job and freelance full-time, roughly a year into dating Tyler, I remember specifically dreading how Diane would react, even more than I dreaded my own parents' reaction, which says something about the particular weight her opinion had already begun to carry in my life. My own parents, when I told them, were cautiously supportive, asking practical questions about health insurance and income stability, the ordinary concerns any parent raises when an adult child makes a significant career pivot, but ultimately trusting my judgment once I walked them through the actual numbers. Diane's reaction, when Tyler and I told his parents together over dinner, was a masterclass in polite disapproval, delivered without ever technically saying anything disapproving. "That's brave," she said, in a tone that made unmistakably clear she meant the opposite of brave. "I hope it works out for you. The freelance world can be so unpredictable." I tried, in that early conversation, to walk her through the actual financial reality, that my freelance income had already surpassed my salary, that I had a stable client base, that this wasn't an impulsive leap, but a calculated transition. Diane listened politely, nodded at the appropriate moments, and then, within the same conversation, pivoted to asking Tyler's father a question about his own upcoming case at the firm, effectively signaling, without ever saying so directly, that the topic of my career had been sufficiently addressed and could now be set aside. I want to be honest that this pattern, genuine information delivered, politely acknowledged, then quietly dismissed, would repeat itself so many times over the following 2 years that I eventually stopped expecting anything different. Tyler proposed about 18 months after we started dating, and our engagement year brought Diane and me into considerably closer contact, as wedding planning inevitably does with future in-laws. I want to acknowledge, fairly, that Diane was genuinely helpful during much of the wedding planning process, offering vendor recommendations, helping coordinate with Tyler's extended family, contributing generously to certain aspects of the wedding budget. This wasn't a relationship defined entirely by conflict. There were real moments of warmth and connection during that year, which is part of why the pattern around my career felt so specifically frustrating. It existed alongside genuine, if imperfect, affection in other areas of our relationship. During the wedding planning process, Diane made a comment that, in retrospect, set the template for everything that would follow. We were discussing the wedding program, and she asked what I wanted listed under my name for occupation. Graphic designer felt too vague to me, so I suggested freelance brand designer, which felt like an accurate professional title. Diane suggested, gently, that I might simply put designer, explaining that freelance sometimes read as less established to older wedding guests who might not fully understand the modern freelance economy. I remember feeling a flash of frustration at the suggestion, but ultimately conceding, telling myself it was a minor detail not worth a conflict during an already stressful planning process. Looking back, I recognize that concession, small as it was, as an early instance of a pattern I would repeat many times over the following 2 years, absorbing small dismissals of my professional identity rather than pushing back, telling myself each individual instance was too minor to be worth the friction of addressing directly. Tyler and I married just over 2 years ago, and the early months of our marriage settled into a genuinely happy rhythm, my freelance business continuing to grow steadily alongside our new life together as a married couple. Diane's pattern around my career continued largely unchanged during this period: polite tolerance in direct conversation, subtle minimization in how she described my work to others. I remember overhearing her, at a family gathering, introduce me to a friend as Tyler's wife. She does some freelance design work here and there, a description that technically wasn't inaccurate, but that flattened 2 years of genuine business growth into something that sounded distinctly casual and part-time. I corrected her, gently, in that specific instance. I actually run my own design business full-time, I said, smiling but direct. I left my corporate job about 2 years ago to focus on it. Diane's friends seemed genuinely impressed, asking a few follow-up questions about my work. Diane, for her part, offered a tight smile and redirected the conversation shortly afterward, a pattern I would notice repeat itself, specifically whenever my career threatened to receive more genuine interest from others than she seemed comfortable allowing it. I want to pause here and say something I've come to understand more clearly in hindsight. I don't believe Diane's dismissiveness was ever really about doubting my competence specifically. I believe it reflected a worldview, built over decades of her own professional battles, that categorized real career success in fairly narrow traditional terms: a corner office, a corporate title, a clearly defined institutional hierarchy she could recognize and validate. My freelance business, however financially successful, simply didn't fit the framework she'd spent her entire adult life using to measure professional legitimacy. I became pregnant with Maddie a little over a year into our marriage, news that Diane received with genuine, uncomplicated joy, the first grandchild on Tyler's side of the family, an event she'd clearly been anticipating with real excitement for some time. During my pregnancy, however, Diane's comments about my career took on a new dimension that would ultimately define the pattern I've been describing throughout this story. She began asking, with increasing frequency, about my plans once the baby arrived. Questions that, on the surface, sounded like ordinary interest in how Tyler and I intended to balance parenthood with our careers, but that carried an unmistakable undertone, assuming my freelance work would naturally, obviously, take a backseat to full-time motherhood. "Will you keep doing the design thing part-time?" she asked once. "Or do you think you'll want to focus fully on the baby?" The phrasing itself, the design thing, carried the same diminishing quality I'd absorbed for 2 years by that point, now applied specifically to whether my actual business would survive contact with motherhood. I explained, patiently, that I intended to continue running my business largely unchanged, that the flexibility of freelance work was precisely what would allow me to be present for Maddie without sacrificing the career I'd spent years building. Diane nodded, seemingly accepting this explanation, though I noticed she brought up the same question, in slightly different phrasing, at nearly every subsequent conversation throughout the remainder of my pregnancy. Maddie was born 8 months before the dinner I described at the start of this story, and her arrival marked a clear shift in exactly how Diane framed my work, a shift that, in hindsight, represented the true beginning of the specific dynamic that would eventually explode at that family dinner. Before Maddie's birth, Diane had described my work, however dismissively, in terms that at least acknowledged its existence, the design thing, freelance work here and there. After Maddie was born, a new phrase entered her vocabulary entirely: staying home with the baby. This phrase was, on its surface, entirely accurate. I was, in fact, staying home with Maddie during the day, in the sense that I worked from our house rather than commuting to an office. But Diane deployed the phrase specifically in contexts where it functioned to erase the working half of my daily reality entirely, introducing me to new acquaintances as someone who was staying home with the baby right now, describing my daily schedule to friends as though it consisted purely of childcare, never once acknowledging, in these external descriptions, that I was simultaneously running a business that by that point was generating more revenue than her own son's accounting salary. I want to be honest that I initially tried, several times during Maddie's first few months, to correct this framing directly. I mentioned specific client projects. I mentioned that I'd just delivered a major rebrand for a client, or landed a new retainer contract, or hit a particular revenue milestone. Diane's responses to these updates were consistently brief, polite, and immediately followed by a pivot to some other topic, a pattern so consistent that I eventually recognized it as a deliberate, if perhaps not fully conscious, choice to avoid engaging with information that complicated the narrative she'd already settled into about my life. I want to address, in detail, why Tyler remained largely silent through this entire 18-month pattern, because I think understanding his reasoning matters for the fuller picture of what eventually changed. Tyler's relationship with his mother had been shaped, over 3 decades, by a very specific dynamic. Diane's strong opinions, delivered with the confidence of someone who had fought hard institutional battles and won, versus Tyler's naturally conflict-averse temperament, which had developed, at least in part, as a survival strategy for navigating a household where his mother's convictions were rarely successfully challenged even by his own father. Tyler explained this to me, honestly, during a conversation we had several months into Maddie's life, well before the dinner that finally changed things. "I've just never had success pushing back on my mom directly," he said. "Every time I've tried, over the years, it turns into this whole thing, and I think somewhere along the way, I just learned it was easier to let comments slide than to fight about them." I understood this pattern, even as it frustrated me considerably. I recognized that Tyler's silence wasn't indifference to my feelings. He would, privately, acknowledge that his mother's comments bothered him too, agreeing with me in the car after family dinners that her framing of my work was unfair and inaccurate. But that private agreement never seemed to translate into direct correction in the moment itself, a pattern that left me feeling, increasingly, like I was defending my own professional legitimacy alone, in a family I was supposed to belong to. I raised this specific frustration with Tyler more than once during those 18 months. "I don't need you to fight with your mom," I told him, during one particularly honest conversation about 4 months before Maddie was born. "I just need you to say something, in the moment, when she says something inaccurate about my work. even something small. It would mean a lot to not feel like I'm the only one defending this. Tyler acknowledged the request each time, genuinely intending, I believe, to follow through. But old patterns, developed over 30 years, proved remarkably resistant to good intentions in the specific, uncomfortable moment when his mother made another dismissive comment at the dinner table. In the months leading up to the dinner that finally changed everything, the accumulated weight of Diane's comments had begun to genuinely wear on me in ways I hadn't fully acknowledged, even to myself, until I look back on that period now. I want to describe a few specific instances from those months, because I think the accumulation matters more than any single comment in isolation. At Maddie's baptism, 4 months after her birth, Diane introduced me to several extended family members I'd never met, describing me each time as staying home with the baby, never once mentioning my business, despite the fact that I'd landed my largest single client contract to date just 2 weeks earlier, a $15,000 full rebrand project I was frankly quite proud of. At a birthday dinner for Tyler's father, about 6 weeks before the dinner I've been building toward, Diane spent nearly 20 minutes discussing a former colleague's daughter who had recently made partner at a law firm, praising her real dedication to her career in language that felt, even if unintentionally, pointed in my direction, sitting there with Maddie on my lap, having spent that entire morning on client calls before the dinner even began. I remember, during this period, starting to dread family gatherings in a way I hadn't during my pregnancy or Maddie's earliest months. Not because I disliked Tyler's family generally, but because I'd started anticipating, with a kind of low-grade exhaustion, whatever new iteration of "it must be nice" or "staying home with the baby" would surface at whatever gathering came next. I mentioned this exhaustion to my own sister during a phone call about a month before the dinner, describing the pattern in full for what I think was the first time I'd articulated it that completely, even to myself. Why don't you just correct her every single time, clearly, and stop letting it go? My sister asked, reasonably enough. I don't know, I admitted. I think somewhere along the way, I decided the friction wasn't worth it, but I'm starting to realize that decision has a cost too, just a quieter one. The dinner in question was a fairly ordinary Sunday family gathering. Tyler's parents, his sister Amanda and her husband, all of us crowded around my dining table for the kind of routine family dinner we hosted roughly once a month. Diane arrived already primed for the topic, having apparently just come from a lunch with her old law firm colleagues, several of whom had recently made partner. She spent much of the meal discussing their achievements with visible pride, describing in detail the specific cases and career milestones of women she'd worked alongside decades earlier, before eventually turning the conversation toward me with a question that felt less like curiosity and more like a setup she'd been building toward throughout the entire meal. "So Jenna," she said, "any thought of going back to work once Maddie's a little older? I know it's hard giving up a whole career, but I do think it's important for women to maintain some professional identity beyond motherhood." I felt the familiar tightness of having to decide, again, whether to correct her or simply deflect, a decision I'd made dozens of times over the preceding 18 months, almost always landing on deflection. "I'm still doing my design work, actually," I said carefully. "I never really stopped." Diane waved a hand, the exact gesture she'd used a dozen times before. "Oh, I know you dabble in that. I just mean real, structured career work. It must be nice not having to worry about that pressure right now. Honestly, Tyler's always been the more career-driven one in this family." I felt something shift in my chest in that moment. Not quite anger, but a kind of exhausted clarity, the specific feeling of having absorbed the same dismissal one time too many, compounded by 18 months of near-identical variations on the same underlying erasure. Before I could formulate a response, Tyler set down his fork. "Mom," Tyler said, and something in his tone made the table go quiet, a directness I genuinely hadn't heard him use with his mother in the 18 months I'd known them both, let alone during the entirety of Maddie's short life. Jenna's freelance business brought in more money last year than I did at the firm, he said. Significantly more, actually. She's not dabbling. She's running a real business, one that pays our mortgage as much as my salary does, on top of raising Maddie basically full-time during the day. Diane's face shifted through several expressions in quick succession. Surprise first, then something closer to genuine confusion, as though the information simply didn't fit into whatever framework she'd built about our household over the preceding year and a half. I had no idea, she said, and I believed her, genuinely. This wasn't performative surprise. Diane had simply never asked a direct question specific enough to get an honest answer, and I had, admittedly, stopped volunteering the information after months of it being dismissed anyway. You've never asked, I said, gently but directly. You've asked if I'm going back to work, as though I ever stopped. You've called my business dabbling more times than I can count. I stopped correcting you months ago because it never seemed to change anything, but Tyler's right. This isn't a hobby. It's a legitimate business, and it happens to be the reason we could afford this house. Tyler's father, who had stayed largely silent through most of these family dynamics over the years, spoke up at this point, quietly. Diane, I think we've been operating on some outdated assumptions here. The table sat in an uncomfortable quiet for a long moment, the kind of silence that follows a truth nobody quite expected to surface so directly at a Sunday dinner. Amanda, Tyler's sister, was the first to break it. Wait, seriously? How much are we talking? She asked, with the particular bluntness of a younger sibling, unafraid of the tension her mother had just created. Amanda, Diane said sharply, clearly trying to redirect the conversation before it went further. No, I'm actually curious, Amanda said. You've been implying for a year that Jenna doesn't really work. I want to know if that's actually true, because it kind of sounds like it isn't. I appreciated Amanda's directness more than I expected to. I don't love sharing exact numbers, I said honestly, but Tyler's right that my business has been the larger income source in our house for the past year, especially with everything I've taken on since going full freelance. Amanda turned to her mother. Mom, you literally told me last month that Jenna was figuring out what she wanted to do, now that she had Maddie. That's not even close to what's actually happening. Diane was quiet for a long moment, visibly processing something beyond simple embarrassment. I think I've been operating on an old assumption, she finally said, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in the entire time I'd known her. I assumed freelance meant something more casual than what you're actually describing. What followed, once the initial tension settled and Tyler's father had gently suggested everyone take a breath before continuing, was a genuinely more honest conversation than any Diane and I had managed in 18 months of polite, surface-level interactions. I explained, calmly and without defensiveness, exactly what my business actually looked like. The client roster I'd built over 3 years, the income milestones I'd hit, the specific flexibility that let me nurse Maddie between client calls and still deliver professional work on deadline. I explained the 6-figure revenue year before Maddie was born, the $15,000 rebrand project I'd landed just weeks after her baptism, the ongoing retainer clients who depended on my consistent monthly work. I explained that staying home and not working had never been the same thing, and that the assumption she'd built around that phrase had been actively hurtful, not because I needed her validation, but because it felt like being erased in my own house, at my own dinner table, month after month. Diane, to her genuine credit, didn't immediately pivot to defensiveness. I think, she said slowly, that I spent so many years fighting to be taken seriously as a working mother in a firm that barely tolerated me, that I built this idea that real work only looks one specific way. I think I've been projecting that fight onto you without ever actually asking what your life looks like. I understand where that comes from, I said honestly, but I need you to understand that every time you said, "It must be nice," you weren't just making an observation. You were dismissing an entire business I built from nothing, and dismissing how hard I work every single day to make both things, Maddie and my career, actually function." Diane nodded slowly, and for the first time in 18 months, I genuinely believed she was actually listening rather than simply waiting for the conversation to end. I want to address something important about Tyler's silence over the preceding 18 months in more depth, because I think it matters for the fuller picture of what changed that evening and afterward. After that dinner, once the guests had left and Maddie was down for the night, Tyler and I had our own honest conversation about why he'd stayed quiet through months of his mother's comments, even when he knew they bothered me. "I think I convinced myself it wasn't worth the fight," he admitted. "My mom and I have spent my whole life avoiding direct confrontation, and I fell into old patterns without really thinking about how much that silence was actually costing you." I told him, honestly, that his silence had hurt more than Diane's comments themselves, in some ways, that watching him let those comments slide, dinner after dinner, had made me feel like I was defending myself alone in a family I was supposed to belong to. "I hear that," he said, "and I'm sorry it took this long. I think part of me also didn't fully register how much you'd actually built, because you never made a big deal about it yourself. I should have been paying closer attention, and I should have said something the first time she called it dabbling, not the 15th. That acknowledgement mattered more to me than Diane's shift in perspective, honestly. The recognition that protecting me in these moments wasn't optional, wasn't something to weigh against the discomfort of confronting his mother, but something he owed me as a partner. I told him this directly, and he agreed, in a way that felt considerably more grounded than any of the previous conversations we'd had on this exact topic over the preceding year and a half. "What changed for you tonight?" I asked him. "You've heard her say things just as dismissive before." He thought about it for a long moment. "I think it was watching you decide, in real time, whether to correct her again," he said. "I've watched you make that calculation a dozen times, and every time, I could see how tired it made you. I think I finally just couldn't watch you do it alone one more time." In the weeks since that dinner, the shift in Diane's behavior has been genuine, if imperfect, and I want to describe several specific instances that illustrate the change, because I think concrete examples matter more than a vague assurance that things improved. About 2 weeks after the dinner, Diane called me directly, not through Tyler, not as part of a group family call, but a direct call specifically to me, something she'd rarely done throughout our entire relationship. She asked, with what felt like genuine curiosity, about how I'd built my client base initially, what the biggest challenges of running a freelance business actually were, questions that reflected real interest rather than polite tolerance. She sent a text a few weeks later that meant more to me than I expected it to. "Saw a small business account on Instagram using a logo style that reminded me of your work. Made me think of you. Hope you're both doing well." Small, but genuinely different from a year and a half of dismissive comments delivered with a wine glass in hand. At a subsequent family dinner, about a month after the initial confrontation, Diane introduced me to a new family friend by saying, "This is Jenna, Tyler's wife. She runs her own design business, actually does quite well with it, from what I understand." The description wasn't perfect, still carrying a faint trace of secondhand distance, from what I understand, rather than direct acknowledgement of my own success, but it represented a genuine, measurable shift from 18 months of staying home with the baby, or the design thing. I don't think Diane has fully unlearned decades of a specific worldview about what real work looks like. Old patterns, developed over an entire adult lifetime, rarely disappear completely after one uncomfortable dinner, however honest the conversation that followed. But I do think that dinner forced a genuine reckoning she hadn't previously had reason to have, and I think the fact that Tyler was the one to force it mattered enormously for how seriously she ultimately took it. I want to step back here and address something I've thought about considerably since that dinner, the broader pattern this story reflects, beyond just my specific relationship with Diane. I've talked to enough other women since sharing pieces of this story with friends to recognize that Diane's specific framing, staying home with the baby, deployed to erase genuine income-generating work, is remarkably common, particularly for women who work in less traditional, less immediately legible career formats. Freelancers, small business owners, consultants, anyone whose professional life doesn't map neatly onto a corporate title or a commute to an office building. I think there's something specific happening in these dynamics, something beyond simple generational disagreement. I think, for many people of Diane's generation, professional legitimacy was fought for and earned through very specific, visible institutional markers: a corner office, a partnership, a title that clearly signaled achievement within a recognizable hierarchy. The modern freelance and small business economy, however financially successful, often lacks those visible markers, which makes it easy, even for well-intentioned people, to underestimate or dismiss entirely. I don't say this to excuse the dismissiveness I experienced for 18 months. I say it because I think understanding the underlying pattern matters for anyone else watching this who might be navigating something similar, recognizing that the dismissal you're experiencing might reflect a genuine, if unfair, generational blind spot rather than a personal judgment about your specific competence or worth. I think often about how many months I spent quietly absorbing "it must be nice," telling myself it wasn't worth the friction of correcting someone determined not to hear the truth. If there's one thing I want anyone watching this to take away from my story, it's this: staying home with a baby, whether or not it's paired with a business, a freelance career, or nothing else at all, is legitimate, full-time labor that deserves respect without qualification. But if you are also running a business alongside that labor, the way I was, you don't owe anyone silence about it simply to keep family peace. Diane's dismissal wasn't really about my income. It was about an outdated assumption she'd never been challenged to examine, and challenging it, directly, was ultimately what created room for something more honest between us. I also want to say something to any partners watching this. Silence in the face of a family member's repeated dismissiveness toward your spouse is not neutral. It is functionally a choice to let someone else's comfort matter more than your partner's dignity. Tyler's willingness to finally speak up didn't just correct his mother's assumption. It told me, clearly, exactly where he stood, and it repaired something between us that 18 months of private, after-the-fact agreement in the car ride home had never quite managed to fix. I want to say one more thing, specifically to anyone in a similar position who has been quietly absorbing dismissiveness from an in-law or family member for a long time. The exhaustion of that pattern is real, even when each individual instance feels too small to justify conflict. The accumulation matters. You are allowed to name it, directly, even after months or years of choosing not to. Maddie is 9 months old now. My business had its best quarter yet last month, a fact Diane actually asked about, unprompted, at our most recent dinner, sitting across the table with a genuine curiosity that would have seemed impossible to me 18 months earlier. Tyler and I talk more openly now about these dynamics than we did before that dinner, not just about his mother, but about the broader pattern of when silence protects family peace and when it simply protects someone else's comfort at the expense of my own dignity. It's a conversation we continue to have, honestly, because old patterns don't disappear from either of our lives after just one difficult dinner. If you've ever had someone quietly dismiss work you were doing simply because it didn't look the way they expected real work to look, I want you to know you don't owe anyone your silence to keep the peace, especially not at your own dinner table. If this story resonated with you, tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you'd like to hear more stories like mine, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Because sometimes, the most powerful correction doesn't come from you defending yourself one more time. Sometimes, it comes from the person who finally decides your work and your worth are worth defending out loud.